Good evening. This is I'm Ansa Atta. I'm a professor in the government department here and also the chair of the government department, and I'm incapable, despite my several degrees, of sitting down and talking at the same time. This may not be my only problem. I don't have my notes. It's okay. This I probably can't do without notes. About 2 weeks ago, the president of the Ford Foundation announced a new initiative aimed at undergraduate colleges like our own. The title of the new initiative is Difficult Dialogues. It's meant to promote tough dialogues on undergraduate campuses on issues related to cultural and religious diversity, which have been becoming increasingly contentious as higher education has democratized in the United States and elsewhere, and as our societies have become more diverse and as global contacts have become tighter and more intimate. Our president signed on to that initiative, and I think it's fair to say that on campus we've been having these dialogues for a long time, and many of them, as is our dialogue tonight, have been sponsored by the Dickey Center for International Understanding. Many of those difficult dialogues have been about the Middle East. I think it's fair to say that the Middle East has kind of had a lock on difficult dialogues probably since biblical times. It has cradled great civilizations in a kind of small nursery. It's been the home to the three great monotheistic traditions that humankind has produced. It has been sort of the center of trade routes. It's got resources that many people want. And for all those reasons and others, it has been an area over which there has been a great deal of contention. I think that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict more generally, is a difficult dialogue for a specific set of historical reasons. First of all, this dialogue involves two victim communities. It involves two rights, not a wrong and a right, not even really sort of a half wrong and a half right. It really involves two communities that can argue they have right on their side, and it makes them very invested in mutually exclusive narratives. So that it's very hard for one side to hear the story the other side is telling. That makes dialogue quite difficult. For us in the United States and more generally in what we often call the West, it's a difficult dialogue because it throws pieces of our history we may not like back in our face. History that has to do with anti-Semitism, that has to do with imperialism, parts of our history that are hard. It's a difficult dialogue also, I think, because it's created fissures within the two camps, precisely because it does raise issues of identity. As the contact tightens, each community has had to re-examine its own identity, and those conversations are difficult within communities, and then communities, it becomes difficult between communities as well. So this is a tough dialogue to have. The two people we have with us tonight are, I think, ideally placed to help us through this kind of a dialogue. And this is going to be hard to do without notes, but I'll give it a shot. So Sari Nusseibeh, who's seated immediately to my left, was born, correct me if I'm wrong.
I'll correct you. You're wrong.
Was born in 1949, so the year after the 48 war. Was born in East Jerusalem.
No, that's wrong.
This is getting very difficult. Was born to distinguished parents, distinguished on both sides. His mother's family had been wealthy landowners, as the little Marxist in me might say. Landowners from a town between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. They had been made refugees by the 48 war. His father's family had held the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem for 5 centuries, no less. More. And his father had been wounded in the 48 war. He was later the defense minister for Jordan and also the ambassador to Britain. Mr. Nusseibeh read PPE, read politics, philosophy, and economics at Christ Church, Oxford, which is a good address. He snacked in between classes. It wasn't right after you get up, I assume. He snacked in between classes with Avishai Margalit, who at the time was a student at Queens College and is now professor of philosophy at Hebrew University. He married the philosopher J.L. Austin's daughter. I'm not sure if it's politically correct to say that, but it seems relevant. And in 1978, he took his PhD in medieval Islamic philosophy, from Harvard. He then took a job at 1978. 1978 was 10 years into the occupation that had begun with the 67 war. It was also the year after the Likud Conservative Party in Israel had broken the previous lock the Labor Party had had on political power in Israel. It was the year of the Camp David Accords. So Sari took a job at Birzeit University, the sort of premier Palestinian university on the West Bank. At the time. Of course, yes, he's president of another one at the moment. So took a job there. It was not a time when you could really sit around in peace and quiet and study medieval Islamic philosophy. So he became involved in politics, and I guess to make a long story short, I could say that that by the time the story was over, by the time we got more or less to the present, he had been beaten up by the PLO and jailed by the Israelis. This seems to me, for me, this is on both counts. This is qualification. This is a positive sort of qualification. And when I say beaten up, there were bones broken. He was beaten up. So he is someone who like many students in the room, could have chosen a comfortable life for himself and chose something else, and has consistently tried to promote dialogue between the two communities and peace in the place where he's chosen to live. In June 2003, he and the former head of Israeli intelligence, Ami Aylon, launched what they called the People's Voice Initiative. It's basically a grassroots petition campaign in favor of a two-state solution, a demilitarized Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, an open city in Jerusalem, and no right of return. One might wish to put it a little more tactfully than that, but basically no right of return. No right of return for Palestinians.
To Israel.
To Israel, exactly. So a right of return for Palestinians to the West Bank and a right of return for Jews to Israel proper. He's currently a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Radcliffe in Cambridge. He's writing a book on what is a Palestinian state worth. That is both an exercise in philosophy, his discipline of origin, and in politics, his avocation. He's now also president of the other great university, the Al-Quds University, sort of the Arab University of Jerusalem. So we're very glad to have him with us. And meanwhile, Henry Siegman, in the less tumultuous atmosphere of the United States, was pursuing an equally significant career. Siegman holds a BA from the New School for Social Research. I'm not being coy about his age, I actually don't know what it is. From 1958 to 1963, he was the director of the American Association for Middle East Studies and the editor of its quarterly publication, Middle East Studies. From 1978 to 1994, it's a long time, 16 years, he was the executive director of the American Jewish Congress. That organization was founded in 1916, and since then it has been dedicated not simply to the defense of Jewish interests or to first the creation and then the defense of the security and welfare of the State of Israel, but also more broadly to human rights, to civil rights for minority groups in this country, minority groups broadly construed to include women. And it has a long and distinguished record on all of those scores. Under Henry's tenure, the AJC commissioned what was called the Options Project in the mid-1980s. That project issued a report in 1989. It was a very important report which basically took the 20-year record of occupation on the West Bank and in Gaza, looked at the demographics, looked at the politics, and said to people who had Israel's interests at heart, there's going to be a problem for Israeli democracy, and there's going to be a problem for the nature of the Jewish state. This is something that needs to be addressed. Since 1996, Siegman has directed the U.S. Middle East Project at the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council's project seeks to forge, I'm actually quoting from its mission statement, seeks to forge new private-public sector coalitions to advance the peace process in the Middle East in both its political and economic dimensions. Its programs include an independent task force on strengthening Palestinian public institutions, a study group on Middle East trade options, the U.S. Middle East Project Roundtable, and the U.S.-European consultation on the Middle East. In 1999, that's just before the Second Intifada, for those of you who are trying to keep the chronology straight, the project released an important report entitled Strengthening Palestinian Public Institutions. Henry's articles have informed debate within policy circles as well as for the general public. They've appeared in the New York Times, in commentary, in the New York Review of Books, in the Jerusalem Post, and in Al Aram, which is the newspaper of record in Cairo. Henry has been, in recent months, we had an argument about whether we were pessimistic or optimistic at lunch. It wasn't an argument, unfortunately, but we had a discussion about optimism and pessimism. I'd say that in recent months, Henry has argued that Arafat's death last fall and the election of Mahmoud Abbas to serve as head of the Palestinian Authority created a window of opportunity for progress toward a settlement. He's been very critical of both of what he calls Sharon's unilateralism and of American inaction, and I'm sure he will say more about that in a minute. So he too has been a willing partner and indeed a willing sponsor of difficult dialogues. So with thanks again to the Dickey Center and to its director, Ken Yalowitz, who's sitting right in front of me, and also to Susanna Heschel and Jean Garthwaite, Susanna from the Religion Department and Jewish Studies program, and Jean from the History Department, who were instrumental in getting our speakers to come tonight. I ask you to join with me in welcoming Sari Nusseibeh and Henry Siegman to Dartmouth.
All yours.
So,
It's all yours.
What do we do, the opening remarks?
so the format, which obviously we had agreed to in advance, the format is that each of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes. And then we'll open it up to questions. And when we do open it up to questions, I will, for once, prefer the young to the older. And I'll ask you to please keep your questions short so that we can maximize the number of questions and also maximize the time for our speakers. And Henry, I think we actually agreed that you were going to start.
That wasn't my question. Where should I speak from?
If you're like me and can't speak sitting down, you can
go there. Okay.
Is it on? Great. You can go to the lectern. And I'll get you water.
Great, thank you. Give it a test.
Yes. Do you hear me, folks? Because if I strike out again, I sit down. You can hear me? Yeah, that's a very weak yes. Okay, good. Now I hear you, too. I also wanted to, I was about to say that it's always such a delight to be together with Sari Nusseibeh. In fact, I was with him quite recently in Boston when the two of us spoke about essentially the same issues. And if we do well today, then I think we may develop a song and dance roadshow that we... I have been asked, I intend just to make a fairly brief, I always promise that and then wind up speaking for a half hour, but a fairly brief remarks that hopefully will stimulate, trigger discussion. If you are here expecting, a Palestinian speaker and an American Jewish speaker who are going to provide entertainment as we go at one another, I'm afraid you will be disappointed. But I hope there will be, our views are not identical, I suppose, but we share many views on the fundamentals. And if hopefully during the discussion, other points of view will emerge as well. Let me essentially limit my remarks to the latest developments, not to give you a long historical account, at least as I read the history. Or incidentally, since you were told that my age is not indicated, on the bio that was read by our presider, I won't tell you my age, but I will tell you that I have 3 great-grandchildren. And because I'm very proud of that, I tell my audiences that. And I hope they won't be too angry, that they'll be kinder to me when I say things that they may not be happy with. I will limit my remarks to the current situation, to this window of opportunity that was created when Arafat's passing, the passing of the, quote, not a peace partner, Arafat, who was not seen as a peace partner neither by Prime Minister Sharon nor by President Bush, and by many people in Israel and throughout much of the world. So when he left the scene, and more importantly, when he was replaced by Abu Mazen, a man who is very well regarded, at least in the public statements made about him, both by Sharon and President Bush, that seemed to make available finally a partner, a Palestinian partner for peace. And no such partner existed as far as not just Prime Minister Sharon, but most Israelis were concerned. So that was one of the important factors in creating the sense that there is now a window of opportunity that did not exist before. And Abu Mazen was a man, you will recall, who was pushed very hard, was sponsored by the United States, President Bush, and Prime Minister Sharon to assume the position of Prime Minister when it was created about 3 years ago. And it was a new position. Its purpose was to take some power away from Arafat and to make possible reforms within the Palestinian Authority, but most importantly, to give Israel and Israel's leadership someone they are far more comfortable talking with. Of course, he was seen as America's man. He was seen as Israel's man by many people in the Arab world and within the Palestinian community. So the question was whether he would be able, in the face of the obstructionism that everyone understood would be directed at him by Arafat, who didn't want to share power. This prime ministership was forced on him. Whether he would be able to succeed to stand up to Arafat by virtue of some of the changes that would come about introduced by Israel, by Prime Minister Sharon, supported and urged to do so by President Bush, in order to prove that someone who is opposed to violence, and he personally expressed his opposition to the intifada, to a violent intifada. He argued, well before he assumed this new position, that Palestinians cannot make any real progress towards their national goals and aspirations if they resort to violence, because that is, he didn't necessarily talk in moral terms, but he certainly talked in political terms. He said that is an arena where Sharon and the IDF will always defeat the Palestinians. And he therefore took a very unpopular position within the Palestinian community in opposition to the Intifada. And the question of whether he could convince this internal opposition depended very much on what it is that Israel and Prime Minister Sharon would give him. Make a long story short, he got very little, and 3 months later, he had to resign. So, and there was a great deal of breastfeeding in Israel afterwards. Even the head of the IDF publicly criticized Prime Minister Sharon for having failed to deliver. Some people publicly criticized the U.S. administration, Secretary of State Powell and the President, for not having delivered on their promise. The President said at the time when they had this public ceremony launching this new premiership of Abu Mazen at the time, he said, I'm going to ride herd on both sides to meet their commitments and to change the situation, to improve the life of Palestinians, to end terror, and so on. Unfortunately, he did not, the U.S. administration did nothing to make any of that happen, and so the man was destroyed. The rug was pulled from under him. Now, it's very rare. I started saying that the chief of staff and many others in Israel, the head of the security services, all of them said afterwards, we made a terrible mistake. We should have helped this man, and if only we get another chance, we'll do it right the next time. Even Sharon indirectly admitted that there were some problems in the way he dealt with that situation. So the extraordinary thing in history happened, and there was a new window of opportunity that reopened again. And there was a great deal of optimism, even on the part of skeptics like me, because we thought that some lessons had been learned from that first experience, from that first terrible disappointment. And that this time around, particularly since there isn't the opposition, there isn't the shadow of Arafat over the premiership of Abu Mazen, that this time around things would go differently. That Prime Minister Sharon would deliver on his commitment that he made once again, that he is committed to the roadmap, that he will follow the roadmap, that he will do what he can to advance the cause of a viable Palestinian state. He agreed with the President. that, and this is language in the roadmap, are not just viable, a sovereign, territorially contiguous Palestinian state, that these are all goals that he endorsed and that he would do his best, his part to make sure that these goals are achieved. Well, I must tell you and skip some of the history here that essentially none of these promises have been delivered on. And the record quickly suggests the following. On the Palestinian side, one cannot say that Abu Mazen did everything the roadmap required. He did not, quote, dismantle the so-called the institutions of terrorism. There's a term of art that I forget at the moment that is used to dismantle the structures of violence and terrorism. He decided early on, make no bones about it, that he cannot pull off that kind of a direct confrontation to dismantle Hamas, Jihad, and the other groups that have engaged in terrorist activity, and that his goal would be to get them to agree to a ceasefire, perhaps initially a lull, and if it works well, that lull would become a more formal ceasefire, and to bring them into the political process, to bring the members of the terrorist wings of these organizations into the security services, and in this way to civilize and deterrorize, if you will, these institutions by giving them a stake in the political process, something that Arafat incidentally never allowed, because there were many efforts over time to, particularly those that were initiated by Egypt, to achieve this goal, and in the end they always broke up because Arafat would not really allow any level of power sharing with the Palestinian Authority or the PLO. But he was prepared to do that, and he thought his approach would produce results, while he was not able nor willing to create a Palestinian civil war, which he thought would simply play into the hands of Israeli rejectionists. And one has to, if you look at the record objectively, one has to admit that Abu Mazen had some remarkable achievements to his credit, that he in fact got the most important terrorist organizations, or the organizations that sponsor terror, Hamas and Jihad, and the Al-Aqsa Intifada groups, he got them to agree to not a formal long-term ceasefire, but to an initial stand-down, and to see whether the response from Israel is such that it can be that he could convince them to enlarge the ceasefire into something more long-term and more permanent. The fact of the matter is, for example, that in this past month, the month of March, not a single Israeli died from a terror attack. Now, when you think back on how Abu Mazen was seen by Palestinians in the Arab world, by Americans and so on, as essentially a very weak person, what he has achieved so far is absolutely extraordinary. No one would have predicted that he had the capacity to do that. Now, one would have thought, incidentally, he did other remarkable things. He has very considerably diminished the level of incitement that one hears in the Palestinian community, particularly on the part of religious leaders at the time of when they do their sermons. In fact, he has instituted a system which civil libertarians probably would not be very happy with, that there are censors who must first pass on their sermons before they're allowed to deliver their sermons. And Israelis have said publicly, have given him credit for having lowered dramatically the level of incitement that came from those sources. And these are not minor achievements. He also has placed, even though he has not yet implemented them, but he has placed on the internal agenda of the Palestinian Authority with great difficulty, for reasons we don't have the time to go into now, because of internal opposition from Abu Allah and other old-time leaders who don't want to give up existing privileges. But he has placed on the agenda very serious reforms, which I believe in the next few weeks he will, in anticipation of an important legislative election to the Palestinian Legislative Council, he will implement, over the strong objections of some of the old-timers who are his peers, who don't want to lose their privileges. So he's done many things. He hasn't done everything demanded of him, but he's done many things that represent a radical departure from previous patterns. Now, one would think that a prime minister in Israel, whose greatest concern is the security of Israeli citizens, to stop this butchery of innocent people in Israeli towns, in restaurants, in theaters, in clubs, young people, who has said that he cannot sit down and begin a dialogue with a serious peace negotiation with the Palestinians as long as this kind of terror continues. That when he finally gets a person in office who is able to achieve what I have described to you, that he would do everything in his power to give this man the credibility he needs to survive politically, to answer his critics, to prove the point that if you deal with Israel not through suicide bombers, but you deal with its leadership through a political process, Palestinians can make far more progress towards to the achievement of their national goals, and to end the suffering, to end the indescribable conditions so many Palestinians live under in the West Bank. Rather than look for excuses and say, well, he hasn't really done everything precisely the way the roadmap required him, and consequently, in fact, even he came here to the meeting in Washington with the president, and his major theme was Abu Mazen, we must warn the Americans, Abu Mazen is about probably to fall. He can't survive, and therefore we must make contingency plans to deal with that kind of a situation. What I'm suggesting to you is that Abu Mazen is highly likely to fall as prime minister, as president of the Palestinian Authority. And he will do so because once again, Israel's leadership, and its prime minister specifically, has done virtually nothing, zero, to change conditions on the ground, to improve the lives of Palestinians who live in villages that remain completely separated one from the other and prevent any kind of movement of people, of goods, and very often children who on their way to school or people on their way to hospitals. All of this remains essentially unchanged. A few checkpoints were removed, but the overwhelming majority of checkpoints remain in place. But what is worse, and what is even more destructive of Abu Mazen's ability to survive, Sharon has used the departure, and incidentally I should have said earlier that one of the elements, positive elements in the picture on the Israeli side was Sharon's decision to withdraw from the settlements and the settlers from Gaza and from 4 settlements in the West Bank, in the northern West Bank. But as you know, it's all over the papers now, most people have come to understand that Sharon withdrew from Gaza not with the intention of using it as a bridge to a much more ambitious peace process that will deal with the occupation as such in the West Bank. He has used it to gain time, to gain leverage, to do things that normally the international community would have been up in arms about, and that is to actually prevent any further withdrawals from the West Bank, to deepen the occupation, to enlarge settlements. And he did so both in defiance of the roadmap, which he says to this day hasn't kicked in yet. He's not obligated. The Palestinians, he insists, are obligated by the roadmap, but Israel is not. He said at some point in when Palestinians will have done everything right, and it is Prime Minister Sharon, not a third party or the quartet or an international body that will decide. It is Prime Minister Sharon who will decide when the time has come. Then Israel will feel it will be obligated to observe the roadmap. But for the time being, it has no such obligations. And it has no obligations to begin a political process or political negotiations. That's somewhere down the line. And a Palestinian state is several generations down the line. Perhaps some kind of an interim arrangement, which is not a state. But again, Palestinians will have to prove in 10 or 20 years that they are really to be trusted to have a state of their own and to live in freedom. I have to speak shorthand because I've already talked far longer than I should. I regret that what we are seeing as we sit here is the closing of that window. It is very difficult for me, at any rate, to see the survival of any kind of a peace process. The roadmap is dead for all practical purposes, and the danger of a very violent new version of the Intifada returning, coming on the back of a new deep disenchantment by the Palestinian people about their own future, is one that should worry all of us.
So can everyone hears me, right? So would you?
You can move around. You don't have to.
I don't have to, okay.
But you can put that in your pocket.
I can do that, okay. What else?
Speaking uninterrupted.
Okay. All right, so, I suppose it was very depressing to hear Henry speaking. And he's not always like this. It's only, in the last few years, perhaps, he's sort of began sounding depressed. Some people, he says, always found him depressing. So I'd like to, always or ordinarily, I wouldn't actually disagree with much of what he says, but I wish to disagree. And I'm glad to see a point of disagreement, and I'm going to start with that. And the point of disagreement, actually, has to do with Arafat and Abbas. Now, the many faults that Arafat is responsible for, but I personally think that he was not actually an obstacle as such to achieving peace. I believe personally that he was interested. He really was committed, if you like, deep inside to achieving peace. I think one of his faults was he didn't quite know how to go about doing it. And he made a lot of mistakes along the way. He misread, miscalculated, you name it. But I believe he really was interested, and I believe that only he, in fact, was or could have been able in the first place to get the Palestinians, the Palestinian people, to come closer towards a peace agreement, a historic reconciliation with Israel. The Oslo Agreement, for whatever reason one might either be for or against it, in fact, broke a line in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, indeed in the history of the Arab-Israeli confrontation. It was a sea change in that it brought the Palestinians to come to see Israel in new terms and to think in terms, in other words, of making peace with Israel. I think Arafat, and only Arafat, in fact, was able to do this. Abbas was with Arafat all the time. He never had the chance or the ability or the charisma or the leadership or the cleverness or what have you to make this major crossing. So, I think Arafat was actually responsible for bringing us closer to peace. Nonetheless, having brought us closer to peace, having broken the barrier, the ice barrier between us and the Israelis, he made a lot of mistakes. And he didn't quite know how to make full use of that opportunity. Now, but he wasn't the only party responsible for the failure of the process. The other party which was responsible, has been responsible for a long time for the failure of the process, was the Israeli side. And by the Israeli side, I don't mean Mr. Sharon as opposed to Mr. whoever. I believe, the Israeli side, just in general, the Israeli side. Because the Israeli side, in fact, to my mind, at the level of the leadership, was never, and still until today, committed fully, absolutely, 100% to the thesis that peace can only come about through a withdrawal from the territories occupied in 1967, and I mean the territories occupied in 1967, including East Jerusalem, and therefore recognizing the Palestinians, whoever they are represented by, Arafat, Arafat, whoever, represented by the Palestinians, to recognize them as the leadership. Now, in the 30 years since the occupation began, we started off with territories that had absolutely no settlers, and ended up today with a population of settlers close to just under 500,000 people. Just under 500,000 people. And when I say settlers, I mean not only the ones that the Israelis count, because the Israelis count only the settlers like in Gaza or in the West Bank. I also count the settlers in and around East Jerusalem. If you count them all up, they are close to under 500,000 people. It's a great number of people if you take into account that actually the population of the people altogether, the Palestinians, in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, is, I can't remember how much it is now, but it's not much more anyway than 2 million people. So if it's under, if it's like that, about the Palestinians altogether today probably are about 3 million people between the West Bank and Gaza. But if you take the fact that you have 500,000 or just under 500,000 people of 3 million people, that's quite a large percentage, right? And if you take into account the infrastructure, the building, the roads, all of it, it's just mind-boggling. You can't actually imagine how it is possible to conceive of a commitment to a withdrawal to 67 and recognition on the one hand, with all of that going on the other hand. Now, okay, so the problem, in my opinion, historically, has not only been, or the fault has not only been Arafat. Although Arafat was a problem, I agree with you, in many cases, but he was not the only cause for the problem. The cause for the problem was shared on both sides. When the Israelis and the Palestinians signed the Oslo Peace Agreement back in 93 or 94, whenever it was, this was like, I liken it to a child being born. And the child being born was born partly of the father and partly of the mother. It was born of two. And the two are, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And there you had a child that was born that was Oslo. Now the child died. When did the child die? I'm not sure when he died or she died. But they died. Sometime over the past 14, 15 years, this child died. Now, some people will come and say, since the child died, we have to blame somebody. And in this case, let's, for example, blame the mother. Well, if a child dies, God forbid, for any one of us, or anyone that is close to us, and a child dies, and we come to blame one party one parent of the child for the death, we surely would be going about it the wrong way, because it makes no sense to say only one parent was responsible and to blame, and the other parent had nothing to do with it, was innocent. It was their duty, both parents, to make sure, that the child will not die. And Oslo was like this. A peace process was born, and there were two parents, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and unfortunately, neither the Israelis nor we, the Palestinians, took enough care of this child to make sure it will grow, and that it will grow into a healthy being. Okay, is Abbas such a great person? I think there are many advantages that Abbas has. And I agree with many of the things that we heard about Abbas, being efficient. He runs his authority much more efficiently than Arafat did. At least he knows what management is. Arafat didn't know that. And he is not into corruption. Arafat liked to corrupt corruptible people, and he did it well. But he nonetheless respected non-corruptible people, and it is something that you should know. Arafat corrupted corruptible people and despised them and used them. But when it came to non-corruptible people, Arafat respected them. That's important to know. Now, Abbas, doesn't like corruption of any kind, and so he's very efficient. I think he will run the system properly, but I'm not really so sure about how far he will be able to lead us. The reason being, let me disagree with one thing we heard Henry saying about, for instance, this alliance with Hamas. Now, to my mind, bringing Hamas into the fold, the political fold, while from some manner it is viewed as a great success, from another it can be viewed as a major disaster. Why? Because as you bring in such a political group to let them share the power with you, there are two things that can happen. They can either, you can either lead them, you can control what they do, but the other side is that they can control you. Now, what is going to happen in the new alliance between Hamas and Abbas? They rhyme well, but I don't think that's a good reason for them to stay together. Abbas should be leading us towards a peace agreement with Israel. That's, I think, his agenda. That's his mandate. That's why we voted for him. That's why we elected him, to make sure he leads us to an agreement. But nobody believes that with Hamas on his side, he will actually be able to get us there, because they will always be pulling him back. Now, they will be pulling him back in different ways, with different methods. They might dampen his spirits. They might tell him, no, we shouldn't do this today, maybe tomorrow. I don't believe, in other words, that having the people who are ideologically committed against the existence of the State of Israel, I shouldn't be saying this, right, as a Palestinian, but I'm saying it. But, some party that is committed against the existence of the State of Israel has no business being in a position where the agenda is to negotiate with Israel a permanent settlement. The only purpose that could be served would be to push a permanent settlement further away from the present. Now, what do you think? What do I think? What do you think will happen tomorrow, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, in 50 years' time? Where are we going to go? Because, all right, we elected Abbas, Sharon is there, but life is such that tomorrow they will change. We will have other people. The question to ask ourselves behind Abbas and behind Sharon the question is, what's happening underneath, on the ground? What is likely to happen? How will things unfold? What are we likely to see? Are people going to get closer to each other? Are we going to be able to, in fact, come to the point where we can draw a border between us, even with the settlements, and with the further settlements that will be there in another 10 or 20 or 30 years' time? Is it going to be possible? Jerusalem. Take Jerusalem. Is it going to be possible? Is it possible today to think of a creative way in which we can share it as Palestinians and Israelis in two states? Now, let us assume that it's not possible. Let's assume we can't draw a line between the two states. Let's assume that we will not be able to achieve a settlement. Then what is going to happen, either to us or to the Israelis? Clearly, we are going to be at each other's throats for some time, and that will take some years. Then, a little bit later on, both sides will wake up to the fact that this can't go on, and we have to make peace. They will look around, and they will find out, both sides, that it's impossible, in fact, to make peace on the basis of two states. Then they will fight some more, they'll think some more, and then what? Either they will go on fighting forever, or at some point or another, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, people will wake up to the two facts. One, that violence does not work, that killing does not work, and I mean killing that is either done by us against the Israelis or that is done by the Israelis against us. Of course, I'm not thinking of killing in the sort of large numbers, of course. But killing in the way that it's done just doesn't work. I think the Israelis realize this. The Palestinians today realize this more than ever. One, killing doesn't work. Two, that the only way forward is through using reason. And three, what people should be looking for is to somehow achieve a life of dignity, of stability, of sustainability, a life that will allow individuals to grow freely. And the only way that this can be done, probably 50 years from now or 40 years from now, if we can't make it today on the basis of two states, probably will be in the context of one state. So we will have spent 100 years killing each other, fighting each other, trying our best to avoid a one-state solution, and we will find ourselves, by default, 50 years from now, actually in such a situation. And who knows? Who knows? Maybe if we find ourselves in such a situation, in fact, it will be better for both of us, for the Israelis as well as for the Palestinians. But I want to say one last thing before I sit down. I personally, ideally speaking, believe in a one-state solution with everyone living everywhere they want. Jews wanting to live in Jericho or Hebron or Nablus to live, and Palestinians who want to live in Akka or Haifa or Gaza to live. I believe this is an ideal situation where all Palestinians and all Jews who wish to live in that country can live there as equals and as free in one system. Fine. However, I know that this is actually too much of a dream kind of situation. And I know if you ask most people today, Palestinians or Israelis, they will tell you they don't want such a solution. The Jews want a state of their own, and the Arabs also want a state of their own. That's what people want. And therefore, it makes sense today, rather than do nothing about it, it makes sense to spare no effort to try and bring about such a solution. That's to say, a two-state solution. Now, the leaders may or may not want it to come about, but the publics on both sides want it. If you go and read the polls in Israel, and you go and read the polls in Palestine, you will find that both publics are actually majorities on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side are in favor of the kind of solution that would be acceptable, two-state solution that would be acceptable for the Israelis and for the Palestinians. The upper leadership echelons on both sides don't want it, but the people want it. 80%, 70% on the Israeli side, more than 60, 70% on the Palestinian side. So how, and this is a challenging question, how is it possible to make use of this commitment, this readiness on the part of ordinary people on the Israeli and the Palestinian side? How is it possible to make use of this readiness, translate this in order to push for, make this into a political mechanism to push for actually bringing about a settlement? This is something I've been working on. Henry has been working on in his own way, but certainly I've been working on also in different ways. And working on this, I work on the basis of having faith. Faith, in other words, in life after the conflict. I mean, the people I know have faith in life after death. In my case, I'm trying to develop faith in life after the conflict, that it is in fact not only possible or doable, that it's actually out there, and we, the people, can do it. The Israelis and the Palestinians can do it. And I believe if we have or develop sufficient faith, I call it secular faith, if we develop sufficient faith among Palestinians and Israelis, that we, that is to say the people, not Abbas and not Arafat, and with them or without them, not Sharon, but with them or without them, if we develop the faith that we have the power to make that happen, I think we will be able to activate our will, our combined will, Israelis and Palestinians, to bring it about. I don't think anything else will bring it about. Not the United States, not the government of the United States, not the United Nations, not Europe, not Abbas, not Sharon, only us. That is the only party that can make a future happen, and it is up to us, I believe, to make it happen or not. So everything rests on what the people, Palestinians and Israelis, whether the people have enough power in them to activate their will and bring about such a solution. And if they want it, it will happen. And I'll stop and reply later.
Okay, so we're open for questions, comments. Questions, preferably.
Question.
Stand up. I've been trying to get Dartmouth students to stand up for 20 years. It never works, but go ahead.
Sure. I had a question for Mr. Nusseibeh.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the inclusion of Hamas was sort of not the best way to guarantee peace and negotiation in Israel. How would you, how in your mind would you deal with an organization that has such political clout, and what's the alternative, I guess?
I think it should be, it should be part of the political map. They should run for office, they should be elected, everything. They should make themselves into a political party. I welcome that. I just say that when you want to form a government and you can do it without them, then it's better not to do it without them, because their strategy and their ideology is different from yours. I'm not saying keep them out of the map, but I'm saying if you can afford it, keep them out of government. Let them be the opposition, but you have to push ahead if you have the majority. And I believe if Abu Mazen, Abbas, says clearly to people, to Palestinians, this is my strategy. I want to make peace on these terms, but those guys don't want to make peace on those terms. And Hamas say the same thing. We can then, the people, decide who we want to support. I think a majority will support Abbas, and he can go form a government and go and make peace and not be tied down. Are there any questions about Arafat?
If there are no questions at the moment, let me say something on the same subject. I hesitate to say that the disagreement is not as profound on this issue between us as it might seem to be. I want to preserve at least some tension in our respective presentations. Having said that, I understand the concerns expressed by Sari about bringing Hamas into the political process. And I agree with him. It is possible to bring them into the political process without bringing them necessarily into the government. But that depends on whether Hamas is prepared to agree on those terms, because they want genuine power sharing. And if they emerge as a strong factor in this coming elections, then indeed they're going to demand a proportionate role of influence in all decision-making. I tend to believe, and perhaps, and this is the area where we may disagree, Sari, I tend to believe that if they are brought into the government, and some of their top people have already said this they've expressed an approach to peacemaking with an Israel that accepts that abandons the goal articulated by them now, that we can only make peace with them after we throw them out of Israel. That we can't accept the legitimacy of it. Their formulas can be found, and fundamentalist groups have been able to devise such formulas in the past that kind of soften the departure from traditional orthodox positions, while they embrace, for practical reasons, new positions. For example, even Hezbollah, just a minor example, Hezbollah said recently that if Israel were to depart from the Shabbat farms, they would give up that's the point where they would give up their military option as well. It's not a terribly dramatic or even perhaps credible promise on their part, but the point is that fundamentalist groups, not just in Islam, but in other religions as well, including in Judaism, have softened and changed their positions using formulas that kind of cushion the heretical aspect of that change. And interestingly, I found that a person who takes this same position is no one less than Ephraim Halevi, who was a former head of the Mossad, and he was until recently the head of the National Security, of Sharon's National Security Council advisor. And he said, he wrote in an article that appeared some months ago, that he does not believe it is possible for Israel to make peace with Palestinians without bringing the Hamas on board. They are too important a political factor in Palestinian society to try to exclude them. And if you do try to exclude them, they will always undermine whatever effort is undertaken to reach that kind of an agreement.
I can't wait to respond.
Just pull this in. There we go.
Well,
Yeah, closer was better.
Okay.
Incidentally, before you respond, let me also, I forgot one point.
Okay.
I
That
also want to talk to Sari,
the-
but talk into the microphone because otherwise nobody can hear you.
The very important point, my concern also is that this argument that Hamas has an inflexible ideology and won't change is being used by totalitarian regimes all over the Middle East, by authoritarian regimes, to say, therefore, we can't do anything. Therefore, we can't reform, we can't introduce democratic governance, and so on. So that
Well,
too,
let me
concerns me.
let me respond. I don't know about the Arab world because but I think the following: Hamas is a political group. They have an ideology. They basically believe that Palestine, the whole of Palestine, is a Waqf or Islamic trust land. It cannot be negotiated away. Nobody has the right to negotiate any part of it away. I mean, they're the mirror image of some extremist Jewish groups. Nobody has the right to negotiate it away. And if one person negotiates it away and signs an agreement in any one point in time, this immediately becomes invalidated by the generations that will come afterwards. They cannot, in other words, bind any generation that will come afterwards. That's one. Two, Hamas has a social ideology. It's a social ideology that speaks about the role of the individual, the role of women, the role of liberty, autonomy, pluralism, tolerance, you name it. And on all those issues, they are extremely backward, actually, in my view. And it seems to me that it's fine to have such groups. It's good to have such groups in existence. It's good if they, in fact, politicize themselves, run for office, run for elections, get into the parliament, try to do what they like. But I am not required, as a person who represents a totally different ideology, I'm not required to appease them. And I don't wish to appease them. And I believe I have to be very clear in my position, distinguishing my ideology from theirs. And I can't do that if, people who look at me see me sharing my power with them. Let them, if they become elected, I have no problem. If they become elected and they assume power and leadership democratically, then I'm obliged to support them. I have no problem. But I'm not obliged to share my government with them. I'm not obliged to put them next to me if I have an ideology, an aim to fulfill. And then there's a price to be paid. There's a price to be paid because, you see, you heard, you just said, they want to share power. And tomorrow they want to do that, and they want to do that. Do you know what among Palestinians the rumor was 15, 20 years ago? Now that I heard this article by the Mossad, ex-Mossad, whatever, the rumor was that actually Hamas was created by the Israeli Secret Service primarily in order to undermine the nationalist movement, the PLO, at the time. And when Arafat came to Jericho or Gaza, Rabin told him, it is true apparently, yes, we did. But they created, what do you call it, a golem, right? They created something they thought they could control, and now it's out of control. But I think Israelis know 100% that putting Hamas on the other side of a negotiating table means one thing, means they don't have on their side to arrive at a permanent settlement. It frees them from the need to negotiate a final settlement with the Palestinians, because the people on the other side, Hamas, will not want the final settlement. And all these people just want to live in a permanent transitory state. Sharon doesn't want to reach a permanent settlement. Hamas doesn't want to reach a permanent settlement. So what happens? Ordinary people like myself, for example, who live there, will find themselves living continuously in a state of suspension without knowing neither our future nor our present, only our past, perhaps.
In back. No, Dad, you gotta sit down. It's the only time I get to do it.
That's her father.
This question is for Mr. Nusseibeh. You earlier mentioned that, in your opinion, the weight lies on the people expressing their will. But that seems very intangible. I mean, what's your view and what's your vision, more of a tangible vision going forward? What solution do you see?
At the end, you mean, or as a mechanism?
No, what's your view? I mean, people expressing their view and their will is fine. It sounds very idealistic, but I mean, what's an actual way to get there?
No, the people's will is actually the way to get there. Okay. The way to express it can be through different means, but one, for instance, such mean is to, I'll give you an idea. Let us say two people sit down, think about what an acceptable solution, what the principles for an acceptable solution might be. They jot them down. They're half a page of paper, half a page long. And then they look at them, they say, let's try to get as many people on both sides to sign their names to this petition. And let us then get this petition, once it's been signed by sufficient people, let's try to use it in order to create pressure on the respective leadership, so that in the end, we go to one leadership and say, this is what the people want, so either you adopt it or step down. And you do the same with the other side. This is one way. Now, we started doing exactly that about 2 years ago. In other words, there is a piece of paper. It's actually now got signatures of just under 500,000 people, both Israelis and Palestinians. And this is something totally unprecedented in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's the first time that something is coming up from below. In other words, if you think about all the other different visions for settlement, most of them have been conceived by very well-meaning people, clever people, imaginative people, either behind closed doors or behind, whatever, and then parachuted down as if from the skies on the people, this is what we have. And including that, you name it, including Madrid and Oslo and all of them. This is a way in which, for the first time, the people themselves activate a support for a thing, and they try to push up. Now, I think it's possible. And I think it's possible. I mean, you might think of other ways, too. And other people can think of other ways. There's no other way. I mean, you have to think of ways in which this will, which exists, has to be used, has to be activated. I am a firm believer in the human being an agent of change. You see, it's either like this, or you say, we can't do anything about it. This is history. This is how things happen. It's either this or this. If you want to take a role, play a role in creating history, at least you must spend every effort in order to do that through political action. It depends on your will, and the will depends on your faith in that it is doable. And its being doable depends also on its being actually objectively doable. I mean, there are 1 or 2 or 3 conditions that have to be there. And there's no reason why people can't do it. No reason whatsoever why people either don't do it or can't do it or sit back and let the matter just go as it's been going for the past I don't know how many years. And I'm surprised that the word idealistic comes from a student who's much younger than me. Should be the other way around.
And no doubt just as idealistic.
What?
I listened with great interest to the presentation, but I'm afraid there should have been another person sitting in another chair and bringing in the part that we, the United States, are doing in creating both the problem and in preventing its solution. We are the taxpayers who are putting millions and millions of dollars in the pockets of the Israelis and some money in the pocket of the Arabs to continue the conflict. And we ought to be talking to the citizens of America, not about two parties that are almost helpless in their fight. They have no capacity to reason. It's the United States alone, with its leadership in the world, and the commission that it can create in bringing in Europe and Asia to help solve that problem. It is not a problem between Palestine, between the Arabs and the Israelis. It's a problem that we do not want to solve in the right way yet. And that point of view was not represented.
Well, I certainly would not come to the defense of President Bush on this issue. I agree with the gentleman. And the problem isn't even the monies we are putting into the pockets of Israelis, and God knows we're not putting very much money into the pockets of Palestinians. And most of the other Arab countries don't need our money, particularly these days with oil at the price that it is. But the problem is that the United States has not played the role that only it can play. If someone were to ask me, do you therefore, in light of what you've told us, do you believe that there is no answer to this problem? Yes, there is. There's a very clear answer, and that is for the U.S. to assume its responsibilities here and to say, and let me back up for just a moment to suggest the reason all of the previous initiatives have failed, in my, there are lots of reasons, but the most fundamental reason they have failed is because the Israelis have not presented to the Palestinians a clear political horizon. They have not said, if you do the right thing, if you stop the violence and so on, there is a truly viable Palestinian state down the road. They have not said that. The Oslo Agreement couldn't even get itself to mention the word the state of Palestine. There's no reference to a Palestinian state in the Oslo Accords. I don't believe a child was born with the Oslo Accords.
Well, half a child.
Not, well, okay, I don't want to get into the issue of partial birth abortions. But they could not even get themselves to say that word. The initiatives that followed, with the exception of the latest one, the roadmap, finally used that terrible word, Palestinian state, but it did it in a way that doesn't define really what we mean. I think what hope there is if the United States, as you have said, joined by the rest of the international community, were to say, here are the parameters. Here's what we're talking about when we talk about a peace process. Here's what we talk about when we talk about a roadmap. It's supposed to lead to an entity within the following parameters. And those parameters are essentially spelled out in the statement that you and Ami Ayalon are getting signatures for. That hasn't happened. The president speaks about a territorially contiguous, and God knows what he means by that. He may be in full accord there's no way of telling, with the notion that you can establish territorial contiguity by building tunnels for Palestinians to go from one isolated canton to another. In fact, this is what he has said. I don't know where President Bush stands on that. But if the international community joined by the United States, because without the United States it won't happen, the quartet won't do it without the U.S., were to say these are the parameters for the final status negotiations, and follow essentially what you and Ami Ayalon have described in those 10 points, is it? 6 points. Then the parties are put on notice that any unilateral actions that they take now that departs from this framework established by the international community will have absolutely no future. Will not get support. Will not get support. Won't be recognized. It's a waste of resources, and it's going to have a very short half-life. This hasn't happened yet, and until it happens, there is no peace. There are no prospects for a peace process. And in the end, Sari may be right. In the end, things will have gone to the point where the only hope is not a Jewish state, because that will have been precluded by the demographics of the situation, but a secular state. And then Sari will have to convince the Israelis that they ought to remain in Israel in those circumstances. Whether that's possible or not, that will be possible if Israelis can be convinced.
People, why not?
They can't. It's possible, Sari, if Israelis are convinced that you will be the president of that state for the next 20 years.
It depends on persons.
I'm wondering about some.
Stand up. I'm an equal opportunity prosecutor.
I'm wondering about some of the grassroots movements in the United States that are fostering some of these ideas that you're talking about. And I'm thinking of several initiatives that I know of. One is an initiative with an organization, a secular organization called Grassroots International, that's working with Unitarian Universalists in the Middle East program of education and action, that is working with U.S. constituencies. Okay? And I don't know what else is going on. I know that AFSC has been deeply involved in this over the years. But I also know that there's been some interesting work done in Palestine, Israel, between women who are working on these difficult dialogues. And I wondered if you could comment on any of those things and whether there's other difficult dialogues going on at a grassroots level, either in that region or in the United States.
Well, maybe we can, I mean, there are lots of dialogues taking place at different levels. Things are bad as you see them, but there are also many good things happening, and one shouldn't be disheartened. But actually, on women in particular, there's a woman back there who happens to belong to one of the groups. What's it called, the Jerusalem Link? Maybe you can tell her about it.
Wait a sec, stand up and
Stand
I've
up.
already forgotten to do that, so introduce yourself.
Speak loud.
Hi. So the Jerusalem Link is a Palestinian-Israeli woman NGO which was established just after the Oslo Peace Agreement with the help of the European Commission. And I happen to be one of the founders of that with Israeli women from the Knesset like Naomi Khazan, Dalia Golan, and so on, and from the Israelis, from the Palestinian side, Hilal Ashrawi, Zahira Kamal, and many other women. And we have established an office or a center called Bat Shalom in West Jerusalem. It means the daughter of peace. And on the Palestinian side, the Center of Women in Jerusalem. We actually have worked quite intensely on the grassroots level to empower women, but mostly with the objective of empowering women in leadership, in negotiations, and so on. But on the grassroots level, in the idea of nonviolent resistance, coexistence, and so on, and we had many micro but also macro joint projects. We used to be, like 10 years ago or so, we used to go as Palestinian women to speak to Israelis in schools, universities, in the kibbutz, and so on. And nowadays we are working with more focus on UN resolution again, although I don't know how much we believe in UN resolutions, but on UN resolution 1325, which calls for the empowerment of women, especially in the participation of women in negotiations, peace and security. This is part of what we are doing. Otherwise, on the Israeli level, there is, of course, the Woman in Black, which is also part of the Jerusalem link, and there are many other women, like the Refuse Mix. There is the woman, refusal woman, and so on. So I have, quite a lot of information on that. If you happen to be more interested, I'll be delighted to give you my address. Thank you.
Just flip the mic out. Yeah, that's okay. Can I just, as a political science, can I just insert that we have two models of change that have been articulated here. We've got a top-down, we've got a bottom-up. And the question earlier actually asked for some way to link those two, and we haven't quite gotten it yet. There's also a domestic dynamic versus change sort of parachuted in externally by outside powers. So
I actually had a question about
that's
that.
what we do in government classes.
I had a question about the second part, which is sort of the external intervention. I think it's a rare instance in history, I believe, where U.S. or foreign intervention has resulted in lasting peace of any sort, or at the very least has not been governed by self-interest or unilateral sort of side-taking. And so given that, I mean, and given the general energy in this room, I guess I really wanted to ask both of you what you thought about this whole notion of, the U.S. coming and doing something productive, I mean, outside of basic human rights activism and that sort of thing. And, do you really see that as the solution? I guess I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to that, but I'd like to hear your views on that.
Can we actually, Sari, can we put you on the spot, because you actually believe in the bottom-up strategy, and you spent a huge amount of time, energy, and creativity in trying to work on a grassroots initiative that would get around the fact that the main actors, the parties in Israel and the elites in the PLO are not so interested in this. So if you had to.
Well, I mean, just to say I agree with what Henry was talking about earlier concerning the United States. I mean, in theory, suppose today the United States, Mr. Bush, put together with him his people, Condoleezza Rice, got onto an airplane, all the stuff, flew out there, booked in some hotel, and said, right, I'm not leaving until both of you come here, and I will stay here until you sign, and these are the parameters. These are the parameters I want you to sign on. I'm sure that it will happen. If he goes and sits there, it will happen. Now, the reason it will happen is because objectively, it's a possible solution. And actually, it's a solution that's supported by people on both sides. So he has, every reason to feel sure that it will happen. Now, the question, will he do it? Now, you said it was a rare instance that the United States ever got involved in a peace process that works. It's even rarer that a president would sort of do this kind of thing, right? So I don't imagine that he will, in short. I don't imagine. And therefore, and I don't see anybody else doing it, because no one else wields the power or the muscle to get it done. And so what's left? What's left is us, the Palestinians, and primarily the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that's why I have devoted so much time, and I don't see another way out. I wish President Bush would sit on an airplane and come and say, right, I have the roadmap, now I have a destination map. And this is the destination map. So that the Israelis, once they commit themselves to the destination map, they will be providing the Palestinians with the horizon that Henry just told us about. That, all right, if you do this, this will happen. It's the only way that it could be done in 2 years or 1 year, but I'm not sure it will be done. So that's why we need to work on the people. And actually the people are also you. Come to think of it, right? And maybe you can do a lot of work Now, it can be in terms of getting, I don't know, President Bush to think about this, congressman, but it can also be in terms of actually creating something here of the sort of thing that we're doing back there. Can I just say something here that, I mean, I very often find when I go out and talk in places outside that, for instance, there's a lot of animosity between a so-called pro-Palestinian and the so-called pro-Israeli lobby. I find very often when I go to places outside. And the animosity, you know, when I come out of Jerusalem, where I am, to give a speech or a talk somewhere, I'm so fed up with the fighting. You know, I come out hoping I'll find a breath of fresh air. And very often I find myself in audiences where, you know, they're still fighting, you know, out in Europe or America, and they're reenacting the fighting that we do back there. And I just always wish that outside people will make peace. That the so-called, the schools of thought, so to speak, will make peace amongst themselves. And I think, you know, if they make peace amongst themselves on the university campuses in the United States, in Europe, I think it will help us, the Israelis and the Palestinians, to make peace. But if we just, you know, what do you call it, inflammate the conflict by going around, we haven't really gotten or done anything or gotten anywhere. So we, the people, here and there, can actually do it if we go about doing it the right way, I think.